So the survey, it wasn't a representative sample. So it was self-selecting. So we advertised it online, through universities, social media, on radio as well. So people who completed the survey were self-selecting. And it was online. It was an online survey. It ran for about 4 months. The development of the survey, we actually developed the questions in conjunction with a number of young people. So one of the things we had to kind of acknowledge as adults that often we get the terminology incorrect, some of the terminology that young people associate with. So we were careful about developing the survey in consultation with them. The survey captured data from older respondents as well. So we did get people over the age of 18 who completed the survey, and that was quite useful because it allowed us to make some comparisons between adults who engage in sexting and young people who engage in sexting. And there are over 2,000 respondents to that survey. So what we were interested in capturing in the survey was perceptions of sexting, practices and motivations for sexting, an understanding of the law, so how young people understood the law in relation to sexting, and also demographic information, so age, location, etc. The focus groups were interested in hearing young people's understandings around sexting, so what their perceptions were and what they'd heard about sexting. We held 8 focus groups in total, and we asked questions about information technology, privacy, negotiating online identity, and also how young people conceptualise sexting and what underpinned their knowledge of the topic. The media component wanted to understand the role of the media in framing knowledge about sexting and the implications of this framing. So we were paying particular attention to who the experts or the opinion makers were around sexting, and some of the themes that position sexting as an issue that society should be concerned about more broadly. And finally, the legal analysis. What we wanted to do there was review and examine the Australian legal approaches to sexting, so how sexting incidences were being dealt with by the law, and thinking through how developments might be made to legislation and policy that might be more effective in dealing with sexting. This is where I'll define sexting for you. So the term sexting actually comes from a conflation of the phrase sexy texts. The term sexting was first actually developed by the media. So one thing we learned quite quickly is that young people themselves don't often use the term sexting, but it's kind of a term that the media created. And initially it was used to describe the sending or receiving of sexually explicit text messages. But more recently the term has been used to describe the digital recording of naked, semi-naked, sexually suggestive or explicit images and their distribution via mobile phone messaging, via email, or through the internet on social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram and Snapchat. I think obviously the developments in technology have changed the definition of sexting as well, because obviously at a certain point of time only text messages could be sent, but now we have mobile phones that allow for the sending of images as well. So sexting is an evolving term, essentially, and it encompasses a wide range of practices, motivations and behaviours, as recognised by the Law Reform Committee of Victoria, who held an inquiry into sexting just 3 years ago. We went back and had a look at how sexting was being discussed in the media. How did they define it? What were the key themes that were being discussed? And we found that the term first emerged in around 2005 in the Australian media. And in the early days, as I said, sexting only related to text messages. So in 2005, 2006, a lot of the stories around sexting were purely to do with sexually suggestive text messages that people were sending to one another. In particular, there were some high-profile scandals. So there was a famous Australian sports person who is involved in what was called a sexting scandal, and there was accusations of him sending sexually suggestive messages to people. So in the early media reporting on sexting, the focus was a lot on celebrities and adults. By 2007, we started to hear reports about sexting involving images and videos as well. And obviously the technological developments of mobile phones were allowing for images to be sent. And so we started to see some of the focus in the media shift. Interestingly, one of the first articles to connect sexting with the sending of nude or semi-nude images related to a police officer who got demoted, and I've got a quote on the board here. So he was caught sending a nude picture of himself via mobile phone to a junior female colleague in December. The woman lodged an official complaint against the Darwin-based officer. By 2008, however, what we found was that a lot of the focus in the media on sexting shifted from reports of celebrity sexting scandals and adult sexting to young people's sexting practices. And this is when the tone of the media discussion really shifted. And a lot of this was prompted by the findings of a survey conducted in Western Australia. And this survey was focusing primarily on cyberbullying, but one of the things that came up in the survey was increasing reports of young people engaging in sexting. And this kind of fed into broader concerns at the time around cyberbullying and technology and young people. So the media then started to focus on young people engaging in sexting. And as they did this, they tried to define the practice, and they tried to define or provide information about people who are engaging in sexting. And this is where we started to see gender and age beginning to feature prominently in many of the media definitions. And we started to see an explicit narrative being developed about the young female protagonist and the male antagonist. So what was happening here was that women were being defined as the producers and senders of what we would call sexts, and young men were being portrayed as the recipients. So there's a couple of examples here from the media reports at the time. So the first one, sexting, this is where they're trying to define what sexting is. Sexting is a practice in which a girl sends her sexual activities on a mobile phone, records her sexual activities on a mobile phone and sends it to her boyfriend, who then sends it on to his friends. And another one, last year a year 10 girl from a private school in Mentone texted nude photos of herself to her boyfriend that quickly spread to his friends and beyond. The practice, which police say is becoming more prevalent amongst adolescent girls, has been dubbed sexting. So in the space of just a few years, what we saw was the media starting to frame the issue of sexting as one in which young girls are the central players, and that girls were engaging in sexting as a result of the requests of boys or men. And while initially framed as a practice engaged in by adults, and certainly that hasn't necessarily changed, the concerns of the media shifted quite quickly to young people's involvement in sexting. And so we start to see in the definitions, like these examples in the media, where age and gender are either explicitly or implicitly referred to in the definitions. So in our analysis of the media reports, what we found was that there was a clear process in which issues were being claimed around sexting, and the in-depth analysis that was missing in those earlier reports that were much more focusing on celebrity scandals started to shift when young people entered the picture. And this is when you start to see experts come out in the media to try and explain sexting, to warn young people of the risks and the dangers of sexting, and to generally provide comment on the issue. So the most commonly cited experts in the media sample that we analysed were the police, understandably. So they provided expert opinion on sexting, particularly from a legal context. And they were also often referred to in regards to their involvement in school education campaigns. So you would see now police officers going into schools and educating young people about the dangers of a whole range of activities, but sexting was increasingly being added to the education schedule. After the police, the next most referenced definers in the media were the developers of government programs and curricula for schools. So you started to see a lot of people working in the field of school education coming out and talking about what schools should be doing to address the concerns around young people engaging in sexting. On the flip side, you have teachers and parents, and in the media reports, they were often kind of depicted as lost, unable to respond to the problem of sexting. Parents in particular were spoken about as if they didn't understand what technologies their children were engaging with and what the implications of that might be. And so there was a real sense in the media that they were trying to educate parents and teachers about what they should be doing, and even just alerting them to the fact that their teenager might be engaging in sexting. So we have police and education experts being positioned as advisors in media articles, and they provided guidance and information to parents about how they should approach and deal with the issue of sexting specifically, but also cyberbullying more generally. So you see sexting and cyberbullying kind of being joined in a lot of these media articles. And you see articles, for example, that would give parents handy tips about how to speak to their teens about sexting and what they should do to try and stop teens from actually engaging in sexting. What we also started to see too was particular expert entrepreneurs or social commentators coming out and giving their opinion about sexting. And so whenever there was a story of a sexting incident that had gone wrong, you would often see the media go to these experts to give their opinion. What was very clear, however, was that teenagers themselves were missing from this media discourse. It was very rare for a young person to be interviewed or quoted in media articles. And so what was happening was a lot of adults talking around the issue, but not actually engaging young people in that conversation. So expert opinion was at the forefront of a lot of this media reporting. I've got some examples here of some of the expert opinions that were reported in the media. The first one here is from a writer and social commentator, Melinda Tankard-Reist. And she said that girls aged 12 and 13 years were getting requests from boys for sexually explicit photos, and the level of blackmail was terrible, like starting a sexual rumour about a girl or pasting her screen captured snap on a naked woman. Reist added that it was all part of the pornification of society and the sexualisation of girls, and it was unfair to expect girls to provide these services to boys due to pressure. So you started to see in the media a lot of discussion around concerns more broadly about how girls in particular were being sexualised in society, and experts coming out and raising concerns about this. The second quote here is from an ex-police officer who now runs cyber safety training. So she goes into schools and provides training around a whole lot of cyber safety issues, including sexting. And it's interesting to see what she focuses on here. So the quote says, "It's about getting them, young people, to think of their digital reputation, which is extremely important when they're going for a job or university placement after leaving school." So another message you're getting in the media is that young people shouldn't engage in sexting because it could threaten their reputation. And the last quote from adolescent and child psychologist Michael Carr-Gregg talks more about developmental issues. So it says here that the part of the brain responsible for understanding the consequence of actions is not yet fully formed in 13-year-olds. Girls of this age also have an overriding desire to have a boyfriend and be popular. So he was focusing a lot on the developmental aspects and young people not being able to make informed decisions around whether or not they should be engaging in this activity. So what became really clear in the analysis of the media was that there was a real discourse of harm being communicated around young people and sexting. And the most common harm that was identified was the risk of prosecution or criminal charges, and often linked in with a reference to the risk of being placed on a sex offenders register. So what we were finding were a lot of stories that were reporting figures of the number of young people who were being charged for sexting and ending up on the sex offender register. And it was very difficult actually to find out the reality of those claims made in the media. But one example here is quite useful. So this is from one media article. Children risk being stuck on the sex offenders register if found with a naked or overtly sexual image of a person under 18. Australian Federal Police Agent James Braithwaite said the images were considered child pornography. He said the law was developed to target serial pedophiles, but it can also capture young people, like a boyfriend and girlfriend, sending images to each other. So you start to see the police coming out saying, well, if you're engaging in this, you're risking having a criminal record. Other common harms that we saw in the media sample were, like I mentioned before, reputation, future career prospects, future relationship prospects, as well as kind of general warnings that the image is permanent. And once it gets out into, the web or the cloud, that individuals have very little control about what happens with that image. So that's a really key theme that came across in the media reports. Another theme that came up was the risk of the image ending up in the hands of pedophiles, and that was increasingly being reported in the media as a potential harm. And the permanence of the image I mentioned. So this is again another police officer reported in a media article saying, obviously things that are posted on the internet are there forever. We don't really put much thought into it now, but this can affect people's lives, their reputations and their careers. So what we're seeing in the media discourse is this real sense of the dangers and the risks and harms that young people face if they're going to engage in sexting behaviour. And once this had been kind of a point of discussion in the press, we started to see politicians pick up on the issue. And the political interest grew quite significantly, and by 2010 we saw a statement by Luke Simpkins, a federal member of parliament, and he marked the first mention of sexting and young people in the Australian Federal Parliament. So in the quote, he notes that although sexting, he doesn't consider sexting to be the same as child pornography, he also mentions that he finds it an unhealthy behaviour, and he considers that it's not right for young people to engage in the behaviour, and questions whether, in order to save young people from embarrassment, whether we should discourage sexting through some other penalties. So for Simpkins, it's clearly this issue of childhood sexuality is something that needs regulation or suppression. So in terms of the law, in many jurisdictions, what we found was that young people could be prosecuted under child pornography, child abuse or misuse of a carriage service law. And penalties could include such things as imprisonment for up to 20 years, being placed on a sex offender register, community service and so on. In Australia, child pornography offences are variously defined, so every jurisdiction will have slightly different definitions, and some jurisdictions have different ages as well in terms of child pornography. We also have seen in Australia that some jurisdictions have raised the age at which a person is deemed to be a child for child pornography offences and expanded the definition of what amounts to child pornography. And it's these particular changes to child pornography laws that mean that these particular laws could theoretically be applied to sexting by young people. In some jurisdictions, a person is deemed to be a child for the purpose of these offences at a higher age level than the age of consent to sexual activity. So what we're finding is that a young person might be able to engage in consensual sex, but if they were to take nude images of themselves, they would actually be committing a child pornography offence. So this has the paradoxical result that in those jurisdictions, a young person can engage in consensual sexual activity, but commits a crime if they record images of that particular activity. So, as Jackson states, children are still not generally treated as sexual beings, and the possibility that they might be makes people feel uneasy. Considering adults' uneasiness with young people's sexuality, and especially expressions of that sexuality, it's easy to see why the law targets these kinds of activities. So of course there are a range of risks for young people who engage in sexting type activities, many of which have been highlighted by the media. Key amongst these are things to do with sexual exploitation through the use of the images, humiliation and damage to reputation, the chance of images finding their way online or finding their way to pedophiles, and the capacity for bullying and blackmail. However, as serious as such outcomes can be for individuals, research has indicated that these kinds of coercive behaviours and negative outcomes from sexting affect only a small number of people that are actually engaging in sexting. So I'm going to talk about some of the survey data that we found in a moment, but from our survey, what we found is that only 6% of those who had ever received a sext had sent it on to a third party. And the number of respondents of young people who indicated they felt pressured or coerced into sending an image was almost insignificant. So what we were finding is that very few young people who are engaging in sexting are doing so in a coercive situation. And of course, we don't want to downplay the dangers to young people of engaging in sexting, but we did find in the data that it suggests that most young people who engage in sexting do not experience the negative outcomes like you read about in the media. So what we started to understand was that there was more going on in discourses about sexting than just the risks to young people that were being communicated in the media. And one element we have suggested is that sexting ties into broader concerns about the regulation of childhood sexuality. So I want to talk about the survey data now. So we had over 2,000 respondents. Just over 1,400 of those were young people and the rest were adults, so age 19 and above. And we found some really interesting data, and as I said before, this isn't a representative sample. So you're obviously getting people responding to this who have some kind of interest in the topic. Of the entire sample, so this is including young people and adults, 49% of our respondents reported that they had sent a sexual picture or image of themselves to someone else. So almost half the people we surveyed had engaged in sexting. And while there are some limitations, obviously, to the survey, we've probably oversampled people who actually have sent pictures, probably because of the modes in which we promoted the survey. Despite this, we think that the figures reflect that the practice of sexting is much more widespread in Australia than much of the existing research might indicate. And there are some similar surveys in other jurisdictions who show similar figures of participation in sexting. The survey also revealed that 67% of respondents had received a sexual image, so they'd been sent a sext. So that's pretty high numbers. When we look at this by the age categories, because we were particularly interested in young people, those aged 18 and below, we found that our younger cohort are much less likely to have sent a sexual image or video of themselves than any other age cohort. So adults are engaging in sexting at higher rates than young people, according to our survey. Nonetheless, 38% of 13 to 15-year-olds reported having sent an image, which is a significant minority of our young cohort, and 50% of 16 to 18-year-olds also reported having sent a sexual image or video. We also found that 62% of 13 to 15-year-olds reported having received a sexual image or video. So you're seeing high levels of people reporting having received images, and 70% of 16 to 18-year-olds having received a sexual image or a video. So pretty high figures. And while much of the academic and popular commentary about sexting has focused on the differing dynamic of gender, so there's a lot of focus on females or girls sending images and boys receiving them, we actually found overall that there was no statistical differences in the prevalence rates between males and females. So in both cohorts, both males and females, we found that roughly 50% of respondents reported having sent an image or a video. The issue of gender, however, was an important factor in the receiving of images. So of the overall cohort, so adults and young people, women and girls were less likely to report that they had received an image than men or boys. So there was 34 questions in the survey, so I'm not going to talk about all of the data we got, but I want to talk about the sort of frequency of sexting. And one of the questions we asked respondents was, in the past 12 months, how many people have you sent a sexual image or a video to? And we found this question was really important because it's something that had been overlooked in previous studies. And indeed, we think it might be a more important angle than attempting to collect data on overall prevalence. So it's always difficult to say, in a lifetime, how many times have you engaged in this? And the point being here that is if individuals who report having sent or received an image have only done so with one person as opposed to 10, the overall prevalence of the social problem is very different. So we asked people to think of a snapshot of the last 12 months, how many people they had sent an image to. Of those that had sent an image, the majority across every age and gender cohort had either not sent to anyone in the past 12 months or had only sent an image to one person. And I've kind of bolded this here. So across the cohort, we're finding that most of the people responding had only sent a message to maybe one person. In the younger age and gender cohorts, those who had sent images were more likely to have sent them to more than one person compared to the adult cohorts. So if you look at some of the figures for the 2 to 5 people or more than 5, you see that it's slightly higher for the teenage age groups compared with the adult age groups. So you have, of males between 13 and 18, you have 27 and 30% versus male adults 24%. So a bit of a difference there. Our evidence suggests that while sending and receiving of images is quite common, most young people who do so with only with maybe a person they've got a romantic relationship with. Females were more likely to have only sent an image to one person, and males were more likely to have sent to more than 5, although it's still very low levels. So if you look down here, more than 5 people, adult females only 1%. We also asked about reception of images over the past 12 months. So how many people have received a sexual image or video from? And you see there's some slight variation here to the previous slide on sending images. So of those who had ever received a sext, the largest percentage of young people from all of the gendered categories, except 16 to 18-year-old girls, had received a sexual image from 2 or more people in the last 12 months. So you see here teenage boys, 42 and 43% had received an image from between 2 and 5 people, females 13 to 15 as well, but 16 to 18-year-old females had more likely received from just one person. The survey also sought to establish the types of relationships between the people who send pictures or videos to one another. And perhaps implicit in a lot of the current discourse around sexting is that it's been a practice that is engaged in by people who are single or people who are in the early stages of a relationship. So it's kind of expressed as something that people just do on a casual basis. What the data from our survey indicates, however, is that those people in some kind of a relationship, particularly those in a long-term relationship, with the exception of married respondents, were more likely to have sent a sexual image or video of themselves than those who are not in a relationship or those who had just started seeing someone. So if you have a look at the bolded figures here, so this is, have you sent a sexual image of yourself? Yes or no. We see that 53% had just started seeing someone, 62% who said yes were casually dating, and 62% in a long-term relationship. So this suggests that those that sent pictures of themselves, in the vast majority of instances, sent them to someone they had an established relationship with. One caveat here would be that we obviously can't conclusively say that those people in the relationship were sending the photos to the partner that they were in that relationship. And we can't establish with any certainty that the respondent was in the relationship when they sent or received the image, but it certainly raises a number of questions about the ways in which sexting has traditionally been understood in media and popular discourse. And these findings reflect other data that's been found on the topic. So in 2010, a survey by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy found that 69% of young people they surveyed had sent explicit messages or nude or semi-nude photos to a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And likewise, a study in 2012 by Mitchell concluded that in most of the episodes, the person responsible for sending a sext was sending and receiving the sext was someone the youth knew in person. So romantic relationships across a number of surveys have come up as the most common relationships in which the sending and receiving of sex occurs. Again, we looked at the receiving as well, so sending and receiving, and we can see that the same is true of the relationship status of those people who are receiving sexual images, as the results indicate. In both cases, the relationship category of marriage was associated with lower prevalence rates, however, which is interesting. So again, you see here, started seeing someone dating relationship or long-term relationship, you see much higher statistics of engaging in sexting. One of the other things we're really interested in the study was perceptions and motivations. So how do young people perceive sexting? And for those who engage in sexting, what are their motivations for doing so? Because a lot of the conversation in the media was around coercive relationships, young people feeling forced into sending sexual images of themselves to someone they might be interested in. And we wanted to unpack whether that was actually the case for the people we surveyed. So we asked people, why did you send a sexual image or video? And what this demonstrates is something quite significant, and particularly when I talk about perceptions in a moment, you'll see that there's actually some very stark differences between how people express their actual motivations for engaging in sexting versus how they perceive the motivations of other people. So rather than related to issues of pressure, motivations of pleasure or desire appear to be driving the motivations of those engaging in the sending of sexual images. So I've bolded them here. If you look at the male teen category, why they send a sexual image, the highest rating responses were things like as a sexy present for a boyfriend or girlfriend, to be fun or flirty, and because I received one. If you look at the female teen responses, you see similar answers. So as a sexy present for a boyfriend or girlfriend, to feel sexy or confident, and to be fun and flirty. You see very kind of low respondents saying, if you look at the second one, to feel pressured. So male teens 4%, female teens 13%. So high, but not as prevalent as you may suspect, given some of the discussion in the media. So for younger girls, the motivations of pleasure and desire dominate, but not as much as it did for the younger males. And indeed, the numbers of respondents choosing the response as a sexy present drop once you look at the adult statistics. So for male adults, you do have 35% as a present for a boyfriend or girlfriend, to be fun and flirty because I received one. So male adults and male teens have same sort of responses, and female adults and female teens, similar responses, but slightly different statistics. So some of this questions some of the earlier research that's been conducted into sexting, which looked a lot at perceptions rather than motivations. So when you actually ask people engaging in sexting about their motivations, it gives us some very different answers to how people perceive the engaging of sexting by young people. We also broke down the perceptions. So if you have a look back here, you have the motivations and intent. Why did you send it? We then asked young people, why do you think other people send sex or sexy images to others? And as we can see from the results, both males and females thought that girls were most likely to send images to get attention because of pressure from the receiver, or in the case of the perception of males as a sexy present, or according to females, to get a girl or guy to like them. So what you're seeing here is a real disconnect between the way individuals themselves articulate their reasons for engaging in sexting and how they perceive the motivations for others engaging in sexting. So this is particularly interesting because this data is very divergent from the ways in which people understand their own motivations. And sorry, I should have said this is girls. So this is, why do you think girls send sexual images? When we look at the boys, we also get a very different picture. So perceptions as to why boys send images were quite different from the girls. And this perhaps reflects some of the stereotyped notions that boys predominantly pressure girls to send them images. But it also reflects the social double standard that it's somehow acceptable or expected that boys might behave in this way. So the data we see here demonstrates that both male and female respondents thought boys were likely to send images to get noticed or show off, with the second most popular response being to get or keep a guy or girl's attention. And significant differences in male and female responses were also apparent. So you have here females saying as a sexy present, but then you also have males saying because he received one. There are other significant differences, with more females than males also choosing pressure from a boyfriend or girlfriend, and more females choosing pressure from friends, while more females are choosing the option to get compliments, to get noticed or show off, and to be included. So what we see here is that males and females are perceived as having different or differing motivations for why they might send an image to someone, and females are judged, if you have a look at these statistics, to get or keep a guy's attention, 54% and 65%, and pressure, 42% and 46%. When you compare them to the figures for males, I mean, the issue of pressure doesn't even factor into those statistics very significantly. This gendered double standard was something that came out quite explicitly when we did the focus group interviews with young people. It was seen that sexting was something that was an acceptable peer activity for young men, but not necessarily for young women. So what young people expressed to us in the focus groups was that young women were seen to, they were pressured to maintain their modesty, and that there was a gender double standard in relation to their engaging in sexting compared to boys. So one focus group participant pointed out that sexting is a normal part of being young and growing up, just to joke around in that kind of way, especially for guys more so than girls. And when asked to elaborate on why male and female sexting practices might be seen differently, one respondent explained that young men often use sexts as a joke and send them to their male friends. And young women, on the other hand, according to one participant, are expected to be modest and not prancing around with their bare legs and cleavage popping out and whatnot. So according to focus group participants, young women were much more likely to be judged and to make the headlines and experience negative repercussions from sexting. So as the third quote here says, it's not really considered humiliating to have anything spread around of you non-consensually as a dude, whereas as a lady, it's kind of an affront and you're becoming the slut or whatever. Another one said that it's not really, I don't know, maybe we're culturally conditioned to do this, but we think in that moment that she was taking a picture of herself, she was in this vain pose, what a stupid idea. But I think, yeah, maybe that life's changing and we should definitely focus on the perpetrator. So what a lot of the young people were suggesting in the focus groups was that there was a real difference in the way that men and boys engaging in sexting were perceived as opposed to women, and that women were judged much more harshly and critiqued much more harshly. And if you think about the stats that came out of the survey, it certainly seems to suggest that women's engaging in, or young females engaging in sexting is seen quite differently from how young men's or boys engaging in sexting is. This kind of unpacking of sexting was also extended to the risks and harms of sexting. So when we spoke to the focus groups, we asked them a lot of questions about what do you think the risks are of engaging in sexting. And while young people repeated some of the same discourse in the media about the potential consequences of sexting, such as, harm for your reputation, future job prospects, and so on, there was also a recognition that perhaps sexting was not always as risky and harmful as the media would have us believe. In fact, for some young people, it was decidedly less risky than the realities of sex itself. And one focus group participant stated that young people often sext to explore their sexuality, so you don't have to actually go through the experience of sex. Furthermore, many young people engaging in sexting did so as part of their relationships and to increase intimacy and maintain long-distance relationships. As one of the male participants explains, and this is the first quote here, he said, "I don't quite understand why it's such a big deal. Like, I wouldn't do it because it seems kind of weird. But if someone wants to do it, that's their relationship and their business." Another female participant explained that for those in relationships, sexting is less risky because of the trust that is built up between participants. So she said, "I think the girls who get their sex sent everywhere are the girls who are sending it to a guy that's not to be trusted. Like couples, girlfriend and boyfriend, it happens between them more often, but no one else would know because they're trusting each other." And importantly, the people participating in the focus groups saw that the message of abstinence from sexting that's commonly represented in the media was a futile message, much like they saw the message for sex abstinence more generally. So the third quote here, it says, "I think people do it and it's a really personal thing." She's talking about sexting. She said, "I don't think you could stop it. It's like people are curious who do it and it's non-confrontational. So I think people are going to do it regardless. I think there's probably fear of the act of sex. So younger people are curious, so they can kind of dabble in it through sexting, and then it's non-confrontational." And then another focus group respondent said, "Young people are told not to have sex either. They still do it. I think you have a discussion about why it's bad, but if you say just don't do it, then they rebel. That's what young people do." Another interviewee said that, "I think it's realistic to expect that young people, by which I mean people under 18, would be aware of the risks involved in sexting and the fact that their images, their text, whatever, are out in the world. And so that would instill in them a fear to refrain from certain forms of sexting. But I don't think it's realistic for governments or anyone else not to expect them to do it whatsoever. I think it's a normal part of being young and growing up just to joke around, especially for guys more so than girls." So some respondents noted that for the most part, sexting goes on undetected and has no negative consequences for those involved. One respondent said that, "I think it's not something that people really talk about, so we only see it when it goes wrong. I'm pretty sure there are plenty of people who are entertaining each other in any way they want with mobile phones." What these responses in our focus groups demonstrate is that young people are very aware that sexting is potentially risky, that they're aware of the rhetoric in the media that it might harm their reputation, their future job prospects, but they also understand that that's not the full picture, and that while a lot of the media stories are focusing on the negative outcomes of sexting, that's not the only story. And for many of them who engage in sexting, and as we saw from the survey, a large proportion of young people and adults are engaging in sexting, it's something that actually has very little negative consequence for them. And this is a discourse that contrasts quite markedly with what is communicated in the press, what they hear about in schools, and what some experts in the field are discussing. So just a few concluding thoughts. Our research confirms that the motivations and practices around sexting by young people rarely fit the rationales behind child pornography offences, that prosecuting children for child pornography offences for sexting alone would do more harm than good. And I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but what seems to be happening is that a lot of people are being diverted away from the criminal justice system because there's an understanding that some of the child pornography legislation isn't an appropriate way to deal with young people's sexting. Given the range of different scenarios that can be labelled sexting, one of the suggestions that we've made is that it might be desirable for guidelines to be developed specifically for sexting behaviours to indicate whether prosecution might be warranted and what factors should be considered in determining whether to prosecute. We've also seen that many education campaigns have been based on the abstinence or responsibilisation message, and that is they seek to present sexting as either always a danger to young people or seeking to make participants responsible for their own negative outcomes. However, the data suggests that these messages do not equate with the lived experience of young people, so they don't see those negative consequences that they're hearing about in these campaigns. Rather, we think that a more realistic and effective approach to regulating sexting behaviour might be more aligned with harm minimisation. More effective might be education that seeks to prepare young people with a sexual ethics, and this ethics might allow participants to understand the context of their behaviour and to be able to identify when they're being exploited or whether they're exploiting others. And finally, the issue of whether to create a new offence to cover non-consensual sexting is one that's been on the table for a few years now in Australia, and it's quite a complex one. On the one hand, it would be preferable to prosecute young people under a different offence to, say, child pornography. But on the other hand, what it could lead to is what we call net widening, or bringing more young people into the criminal justice system, because police prosecuting for an offence might see that this law is specifically designed for sexting rather than diverting young people in the way that we currently understand is going on. So I've only been able to give you a very small snapshot today of the research, but we have published, as you would have heard earlier, a book on sexting in young people, and that gives a more comprehensive account of the research we've done, the surveys, the focus groups, and some of the legal analysis that we carried out. So if anyone has any questions or anything you'd like me to clarify, I'm more than happy to answer them now, if you like. One of the difficulties we found in the research was so many different jurisdictional differences. So even in Australia, every state and territory has different age limits and rules around child pornography legislation, which is generally what sexting kind of gets trapped up under. And the American system is even more confusing in terms of the different jurisdictional approaches. So it'd be interesting to see if anything happens with that particular case. I haven't read the recent reports. Yeah, and there's certainly cases in the United States that we've come across of young people who have been prosecuted and a couple of young people ending up on sex offender registers for sending sex boyfriends and girlfriends to each other. What was really interesting, we came across a media report that claimed that so many hundreds of children had been charged under child pornography legislation for sexting. And we were like, this is interesting. Why have we not heard of this? So we went back to the reporter, and the reporter couldn't remember where they got the data from. So we probably need to do some research with the police. We think a lot of it's being diverted. There have been a few cases of sort of non-consensual sexting, so where maybe someone's taken an image and shared it without permission. And there have been a couple of cases with adults and children, so someone sort of over the age of 18 and someone under the age of consent. But the statistics that this newspaper had, we didn't seem to find any evidence. And we certainly didn't come across anyone in our interviews that had been caught. Yeah, no. We certainly know that there are some centres that are dealing with a lot of young people coming to them who have been victims of their images being circulated. And I think the law is still trying to figure out, because the way that the child pornography legislation was developed, sexting wasn't even, didn't even exist really. And so they're trying to sort of retrofit the child pornography legislation to it. So what we've seen recently in Victoria, one state has started to introduce specific legislation around sexting. I don't know if it's been applied yet, I haven't heard, but I think that's going to be an interesting case study to see whether other states follow and try and have a specific piece of legislation to deal with sexting, particularly non-consensual in terms of sharing the image. That seems to be where the big issue lies. Once someone takes an image that's been sent to them and then circulates it more broadly, that's usually when it comes to the attention of authorities. Actually, I'm not the law expert, but Thomas, who's in our group, is, and that was one thing that did come up, whether copyright. Yeah. So Thomas certainly raised that as a potential issue or as a potential way of responding to it. We don't think it's been used at all, but that is certainly one that kind of came on our radar. And that's certainly one of our concerns that we speak about in the book a lot more, that, yes, you want to make sure that young people aren't being exploited or abused or coerced into these activities in some way, but you also don't want to create a new law that might end up criminalising a whole range of young people when previously it might have been dealt with through other ways, whether it's through diversion or some other form of non-criminal justice intervention, certainly, yeah. And a lot of the young people in the focus groups were sort of saying, these campaigns that just tell us all the bad things that will happen and all the risks of sexting, they don't work. Young people will experiment, they'll explore, and maybe it's better to give us some more information about having sexual relationships in an ethical way, how we actually negotiate relationships with other people. And there's certainly been some research done, I'm sure over here, but also some Australian scholars as well, looking at how to change sexual education in schools to kind of address some of those issues. Yeah. I don't have the figures off the top of my head. There have been some studies done over here, and I think the numbers, one of the problems we found with some of the previous research is how they've actually conducted the surveys. So we came across one study, I think it was here in the US, where they were surveying young people over the telephone. But before the young person got on the phone, often it was the adult or the parent in the family who received the call and then had to hand the phone over to the young person. So, how honest are young people going to be over the phone? Are they more honest, responding to a survey anonymously on the internet? Those sorts of questions come up around the ways in which people get this data. But we think, we think our stats are pretty consistent with what a lot of the other research has found across the US, Europe as well, that the participation rates are relatively high. There have been calls for a public registry, but there isn't one, and I don't know if that will eventuate at all. Sure, I am in contact with some researchers in Europe who are looking at sexting. I'm not too familiar with the legislation around it though, so I'd have to go and check that up. But I think there's certainly some differences in perceptions as well in different locations. And it'd be interesting to see the work we did asking about people's perceptions versus their own motivations is something that hadn't been done in surveys before. So it'd be interesting to see if someone took the survey and did it in different jurisdictions, whether there'd be any variation to those perceptions because of perhaps different societal understandings or different rhetoric around sexting, perhaps in different locations. Yeah, and one interesting thing that when we did the focus groups, we actually asked young people about how they manage their digital presence. And a lot of the young people are very conscious of the fact now that employers will Google them to see, what they can find about them on the internet before they maybe get a job interview. And so a lot of them are very careful about what images and information they will allow online because they are concerned about what the reputational damage might be if there's a photo of them, passed out drunk on the floor and an employer sees that. So I think increasingly particularly as we're seeing lots of different networks kind of joining one another and how these digital profiles can be developed, that it's something that people are becoming more aware of and hopefully trying to manage that information a bit more. And the sexting research is only quite young, so when we started doing the project in around 2011, there hadn't been much written on it, but in the last 5 years there's really been a lot more done around the world looking at it, and I think there's still some kind of future research to be done, particularly as technologies develop. Like I said, you know, when we moved from text messaging only to being able to send images on the phone, that really changed the way in which people communicate, and there might be other forms. We didn't ask anything about other kinds of sexual activity, we only asked about whether they had sexted or not. I don't know if there is any, there might be some research that's doing comparisons. I know there's an academic in the UK, Jessica Ringrose, who does a lot of research around childhood sexuality. She maybe has done something, I can't think off the top of my head, but that would be interesting. I mean, when you look at some of the data from the focus groups, certainly the message that was coming out of there was that, well, this is a safer way for young people to explore their sexuality. So maybe maybe it shouldn't be kind of criticised as much as it is, because young people are doing this rather than actually engaging in sex. But yeah, I haven't come across any, but I'll certainly keep an eye out.